In 1867, the United States made a controversial decision, one that seemed to many Americans like an extravagant mistake. The US purchased the vast and icy wilderness of Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million. At the time, that amounted to just 2 cents per acre for over 586,000 square miles of land. This purchase, derisively known as Seward's Folly, after Secretary of State William Seward, was mocked by critics who believed the US had squandered money on a frozen wasteland. But today, more than 150 years later, the decision to buy Alaska is regarded as one of the most significant geopolitical moves in United States history. What looked like an uninhabitable and remote landmass turned out to be a strategic goldmine in terms of resources, geography, and military importance. So why did the US, still recovering from the Civil War, choose to acquire Alaska? To understand the origins of the Alaska Purchase, we must first consider Russia's situation in the 1860s. The Russian Empire was an enormous and sprawling land power, stretching across Europe and Asia. By the mid-19th century, it had also claimed Alaska, which was known to them as Russian America. However, despite its immense size, Alaska was geographically isolated from the Russian heartland. It was also home to a small population, comprising mainly Russian settlers, indigenous Alaskan communities, and fur traders. Still, Russia's motivation for controlling Alaska initially stemmed from the fur trade, which had been highly lucrative in the 18th century. Russian explorers, fur traders, and officials had ventured into Alaska and established Russian America in the 1740s, claiming the territory for the empire. For a while, Alaska's fur industry was a valuable asset, with sea otter pelts and other furs fetching high prices in Europe and China. However, by the mid-19th century, the fur trade in Alaska was in steep decline. Overhunting and dwindling wildlife populations made the territory less profitable for the Russian Empire. Additionally, maintaining this remote outpost was incredibly expensive. St. Petersburg, Russia's capital, was more than 4,000 miles from Alaska, separated by vast stretches of land and sea. Meanwhile, Russia had bigger concerns closer to home. The empire was facing mounting difficulties in Europe. The Crimean War of 1853 fought against the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France had ended in a disastrous defeat for Russia. This conflict weakened Russia economically and militarily, leaving the empire with pressing issues on the European front. Moreover, Russia had grown fears about British expansion. At the time, British North America, which would later become Canada, bordered Alaska. The British Empire was expanding westward across the continent, and there was a very real possibility that if Russia didn't sell Alaska, it could lose the territory to Britain in a future conflict. Therefore, Russia needed to make a decision. Should it keep a territory that was hard to defend and barely profitable, or should it sell it before it became a liability? As Russia grappled with its Alaska problem, the United States was in the midst of its own transformation. Just a few years earlier, the US had endured the brutal and devastating Civil War of 1861 to 1865, a conflict that had torn the nation apart and left much of the South in ruins. Despite the immense cost of the war, the United States was eager to rebuild, and along with that, it was ready to expand westward, an ambition that had been central to its identity since the early 19th century. But by the 1860s, the United States had already acquired most of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling the promise of manifest destiny. This westward expansion had been fueled by key territorial acquisitions, including the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the annexation of Texas in 1845. The United States had also gained vast new lands through the Mexican Cession in 1848, following the Mexican-American War. With its borders now stretching to the Pacific, the next logical step was to extend American influence beyond the continent. From the American perspective, Alaska might have seemed like a distant frozen wasteland, but there are several reasons why it was actually an attractive prospect for the US government. One of the key factors driving the United States' interest in Alaska was its proximity to British North America. At the time, Britain controlled vast territories to the north of the United States, and there were tensions over border disputes and influence in the Pacific Northwest. If the United States could acquire Alaska, it would create a buffer zone between British North America and Russian interest in the Pacific. By controlling Alaska, the US could prevent British expansion into the region, which was a very real concern. Britain was one of the dominant colonial powers in the 19th century, and its influence was expanding rapidly, especially in Canada. However, the purchase of Alaska was more than just a defensive move against British encroachment. The US also saw Alaska's strategic position as a potential asset for controlling Pacific trade routes. Alaska's coastline stretched thousands of miles along the Bering Sea and the North Pacific Ocean, giving the US the potential to control access to key shipping lanes that connected the Americas to Asia. Therefore, Alaska was seen as a vital geographic location that would allow the US to block British influence, gain access to key waters, and project its power in the northern Pacific. While many Americans initially dismissed Alaska as a frozen wasteland, some forward-thinking leaders like Seward saw the territory's potential for natural resources. At the time of the purchase, Alaska's resources were largely unexplored, but there are clues that the land could be rich in untapped wealth. Alaska's vast forests promised timber resources, and its coastal waters were home to abundant fisheries, including salmon, whales, and other marine life. The fishing industry, especially in the Bering Sea, had the potential to provide the United States with valuable seafood resources, which could be exported to Europe and Asia. Moreover, the possibility of finding precious minerals such as gold and coal in Alaska's mountainous interior excited American prospectors. Though the Klondike gold rush wouldn't occur until the 1890s, many already believed that Alaska's mountains might hold rich veins of gold, silver, and other valuable minerals. Yet, in addition to the land's natural resources, there was the prospect of fur trading, which had been the primary industry during Russian rule. While the fur trade was declining, it still held potential, particularly with sea otters and other fur-bearing animals. As a result, the US saw Alaska not only as a geopolitical asset, but also as a future economic powerhouse that could provide raw materials to fuel American growth. Another reason why Alaska was so appealing to the United States was its location near Asia. Alaska's proximity to Russia, Japan, and China made it a potential gateway for trade with these countries. At the time, the United States had a growing interest in establishing trade relations with Asian markets, particularly China and Japan. The 1850s had seen the opening of Japan to foreign trade thanks to Commodore Perry's expedition, and China was emerging as a major destination for American exports. Alaska, with its long coastline and access to the Pacific Ocean, was ideally positioned to serve as a staging point for American ships headed towards Asia. Furthermore, owning Alaska would give the states a strategic military foothold in the Pacific and Arctic regions. Though this aspect wasn't fully realized until the 20th century, the US already recognized Alaska's importance as a potential defense outpost. The Northern Pacific was becoming an increasingly critical theater for international trade, exploration, and power projection, and Alaska's proximity to Asia and Europe meant it could play a pivotal role in future conflicts or negotiations with these powers. Thus, the acquisition of Alaska wasn't just about controlling American soil, it was about expanding American influence into the Pacific and beyond, providing a launching point for trade and diplomatic endeavors with Asia, and positioning the US as a global power in the making. While Russia was eager to sell Alaska, the United States faced a significant diplomatic challenge in getting the deal done. Secretary of State William Seward, a staunch believer in American expansionism, was the driving force behind the purchase. He saw Alaska as a critical piece of America's future. Despite widespread opposition, negotiations between Russia and the United States began in earnest in the early months of 1867. At the time, the Tsarist government in Russia was keen to offload Alaska for several reasons, primarily because it feared losing the territory to Britain in the future. Additionally, Russia wanted to strengthen its relations with the United States, which it saw as a potential counterweight to Britain's dominance in North America and Europe. Selling Alaska to the US rather than to any European power would not only raise much needed cash, but also serve as a diplomatic gesture. Finally, on March 1867, the Treaty of Cession was signed, transferring Alaska from Russia to the United States. The deal added an immense swath of land to the US, making Alaska the largest state in the Union and almost doubling the size of the continental United States. Even after the purchase was finalized, Alaska remained largely an afterthought for most Americans. For the first few decades of US rule, Alaska was governed as a military district, and very little effort was made to settle or develop the territory. The harsh climate, difficult terrain, and lack of infrastructure made Alaska an unappealing place for most Americans. Everything changed in the 1890s when gold was discovered in the Klondike region of the Yukon Territory, just east of Alaska. The discovery sparked the famous Klondike Gold Rush, which saw thousands of prospectors pour into Alaska and Canada, hoping to become rich. The gold rush put Alaska on the map, transforming it from a forgotten outpost into a bustling frontier. The influx of settlers and the wealth generated by the gold rush accelerated the development of Alaska's infrastructure. Towns and supply lines were established, and the US government began to take a more active role in governing the territory. Alaska's potential for economic growth was finally being realized, although it wasn't just gold that drew people to the region. Other natural resources, including coal, copper, and oil, would soon be discovered, cementing Alaska's economic importance. As the 20th century unfolded, Alaska's strategic importance became more apparent, particularly during World War II. The outbreak of the war in the Pacific Theater thrust Alaska into the spotlight as a key military outpost. The Aleutian Islands, a chain of islands extending westward from the Alaskan mainland, were seen as a potential target for Japanese forces, given their proximity to Japan. In 1942, Japanese forces briefly occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians, marking the only time during World War II that enemy forces occupied US soil. The US military quickly moved to build up defenses in Alaska, constructing airfields, military bases, and fortifications. The Battle of the Aleutian Islands saw American forces successfully repel the Japanese invaders, but the experience underscored Alaska's critical location in protecting the North Pacific. Therefore, by the end of World War II, Alaska's role as a strategic military asset was solidified. The territory's proximity to both Asia and Europe made it an ideal location for military installations and early warning systems, which would become even more important during the Cold War. If you liked the video so far, don't hesitate and click on the button below to subscribe. During the Cold War, Alaska's strategic value grew even further due to its proximity to the Soviet Union. At its narrowest point, the Bering Strait, the body of water separating Alaska and Russia is just 55 miles wide. This close proximity made Alaska a critical point for monitoring Soviet activities and defending against potential missile attacks. Alaska became home to early warning radar systems as part of the Distant Early Warning Line, a network of radar stations built across the Arctic to detect incoming Soviet bombers or missiles. Additionally, the US stationed troops and aircraft in Alaska to defend the North Pacific and Arctic regions, which were seen as possible theaters of conflict in the event of a nuclear war. Thus, Alaska's importance to US defense strategy during the Cold War cannot be overstated. The territory played a key role in protecting the American mainland from Soviet threats, and its military significance extended well into the late 20th century. In addition to its military value, Alaska's nature resources became a major driver of its importance to the United States, particularly with the discovery of oil in Prudhoe Bay in 1968. Prudhoe Bay, located on Alaska's North Slope, turned out to be one of the largest oil fields in North America. The discovery of oil led to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, a 800-mile pipeline that stretches from Prudhoe Bay to the Port of Valdez on Alaska's southern coast. Completed in 1977, the pipeline allowed for the transportation of millions of barrels of oil, fueling the American economy and providing critical energy resources. Moreover, the oil industry transformed Alaska's economy, bringing wealth and development to the region. While the environmental impact of oil drilling has been a source of controversy, the economic benefits of Alaska's oil reserves are undeniable. Looking back, the decision to purchase Alaska from Russia in 1867 was far from a mistake. What many critics at that time saw as a useless frozen landmass turned out to be one of the most important acquisitions in US history. Alaska provided the United States with vast natural resources, a strategic military position, and a gateway to the Pacific and Asia. Today, Alaska is a crucial part of the American landscape, contributing to the nation's defense, economy, and environmental diversity. The vision of William H. Seward, once mocked by his opponents, has now been proven to be correct. Alaska was not only a sound investment, but also a decision that reshaped America's role in the world, providing it with land, wealth, and security in ways that no one in 1867 could have fully imagined. Ultimately, the purchase of Alaska wasn't just about acquiring land, it was about securing the future. Hey everyone! Before we finish, I just want to take a moment to talk to you directly. Creating these videos takes a lot of time and effort, and I do it all by myself. From researching, animating, editing to narrating everything. I genuinely love bringing history to life, but to be honest, balancing this with my full-time job is tough. My goal is to eventually make this my full-time work, which would allow me to produce even more high-quality, engaging content like this one. If you have enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Your support means the world to me and would help me move closer to creating more of these videos more often. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.